Good morning, everybody. Hope you can hear me. Welcome back to the second of our lectures on the long tail of economic crime in South Africa, and we're focusing on the book Apartheid, Guns and Money. I know, well, let me just answer the question. I realize I've got this big boot on. We've been spending a lot of our time trying to kick down doors, and this isn't where it came from, but I managed to twist an ankle while running on a Sunday evening, so hence the big boot. But Mike and I are going to, are very excited to talk to the next part of our three-part lecture today. Yesterday, we looked at the role of businesses and banks in terms of their support for the apartheid government in busting sanctions. We spoke a little bit about the difficulty of undertaking research in this field and many of the obstacles that remain in trying to arrive at not necessarily an ultimate truth, but to gain a better understanding of our past and the many very real interests that remain as obstacles. Tomorrow we're going to be looking more at the long shadow, the longer term impact of which we argue the fact that we haven't dealt with so many of these crimes, of money crimes, economic crimes of the past, how it's played into our present, and perhaps how it has in part informed some of the problems that we face as a country today, and what can be done to hold some of these actors to account, and the work that civil society groups in South Africa, how we're collaborating with groups elsewhere around the world and trying to hold some of those actors to account. Today we're looking at the role of the countries, the countries that, and when we look at countries, we're not necessarily saying we're not looking at the role of companies and banks and others, but we're interested in the role that various countries have played in facilitating sanctions busting during the period from the late 1970s to the early 1990s. Our focus is still primarily on the arms sector, as we explained yesterday, that the importance of the war economy during the late apartheid period means that it would be wrong not to look at this. And secondly, of course, the fact that it was criminal to supply weapons makes it much more interesting when we look at the role that various governments have played in supplying weapons material and in busting oil sanctions that many of those governments, for example, the OPEC governments, we haven't even spoken about that, but countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, many others, including revolutionary governments of the 1980s, continued to conduct their business in duplicity. On the one hand, being vehement critics of apartheid and not wanting anything officially to do with the regime, and on the other hand, supplying oil. And arms, of course, is though the central focus of our discussion. In the book, we've been asked the question of, why focus so much on, we focused on the Big Five, what we call the Big Five, the members of the United Nations Security Council, then the permanent members of the Security Council, and today still the permanent members of the Security Council. They are France, the United States, then the Soviet Union, today Russia, China, and the United Kingdom. And as we tried to explain yesterday, their role as the policemen, if you like, the police officers of the global system within the UN security system was incredibly important. They were the ones who were there to ensure that the law was upheld, that the sanctions, that there was no breaking of sanctions by other states, never mind the activities of those governments themselves. And in the course of the work, what we identified, and you'll see this map, which we call an Atlas of Apartheid Allies, we identified almost 50 countries that in which there were active attempts, not only attempts, but there was where there were successful efforts to bust sanctions. And you'll see those countries are not limited to one part of the globe. They stretch from the United States, South America, a number of countries, including Chile, Argentina. But throughout Western Europe, we see countries that were implicated: Singapore, Indonesia, in Southeast Asia, China, and then in the Middle East, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq. Of course, the apartheid government was fueling both sides of the conflict. on the one hand, so during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, supplying weapons to both Iran and Iraq from the material that we've been able to collect, and at the same time benefiting from the trade in oil with those countries. And then a number of countries across the African continent, whether it was Chad, it was the Democratic Republic of Congo, Zimbabwe, and the picture that's painted, of course, is no longer this very neat picture of a small group of NATO member states in the West, the countries governed by the Margaret Thatchers and Ronald Reagans who supported the apartheid regime, but something that's much more complex and talks about many different countries who supported the regime. And in the book, we focused on these so-called Big Five, the Big Five, which I've now described to you, and what we describe as the proxies and pariahs. The countries, many of those are the countries that are on this map, who either acted as proxies for the Big Five, that they acted in a way as middlemen supplying weapons if a country didn't want to supply, like France or the United States didn't directly want to supply weapons, or China, or they were pariahs, outlier states, the countries that themselves were governed by right-wing, often autocratic regimes, or seen as pariahs for their conduct in terms of their own human rights. Israel, we think of Israel, Chile under Pinochet, Argentina under the military junta of the early 1980s, and a few other countries, Taiwan, partly because China and mainland China, communist China, was then gaining prominence in world politics. And we see relations with all of those countries, but again, when it comes to the pariah states, there's a picture often painted that the apartheid regime only did business with Israel, only did business with Chile under Pinochet. And I guess what we are saying is we only are starting to understand the extent of those relationships, but there is far more complexity. It doesn't mean those relationships aren't important. It doesn't mean that Israel, as one of the pariah states, saw South Africa as its one of its primary earners of foreign revenue in the 1980s. And why was this the case? Because it was exporting technology and weaponry, primarily, some agricultural goods as well, but primarily technology and weaponry exported to South Africa. And if you ever have a chance to read a book by Sasha Polakau-Suransky, a South African who lives in Washington, D.C., who writes for Foreign Policy. He has written a book called and I always get this title wrong, The Unspoken Alliance. There's another book called The Unholy Alliance. It's called The Unspoken Alliance, and I think Sasha's done remarkable work, again, through gaining access to archives, and he shared his archive with us, which sets out the nature of the relationship between Israel and South Africa. But given our time, Michael and I have decided we're going to try and hone in on 4 of the important Big Five states. And perhaps they are instructive in themselves for us to be able to understand the nature of relations between the apartheid regime and other states during the 1970s, 80s, and early 1990s. So we'll be talking about France. Firstly, France. Secondly, we'll be looking at China as a communist country and its relationship with the apartheid regime, then the United States and the United Kingdom. So those are the 4 countries we'll focus on. We were very happy, I think, during the question and answer time to focus a little bit on the proxies and pariahs. Yesterday we ran over quite a bit, and I know we have this room for a couple of minutes after when the session's set to end at 1:15. So if we need a few more minutes and those folks who would like to stay, we may be able to run up to 12:30, but we'll definitely allow sufficient time for questions or comments. So please, please feel free. I think we want this to be very much to be an open forum. But I'd like to start talking about, when we look at those Big Five countries, I'd like to start talking about France. And I'm not going to talk immediately about the 1980s. In fact, I'd like you to think, those who might read the Sunday Times, to 2013. I think it was 2013, 2014. And there was a pretty extraordinary front page headline, which many of us might have forgotten. I don't know if you recall the phrase that made it onto the front page of the Sunday Times one Sunday morning. The lights have gone on the Eiffel Tower. I don't know, does anyone remember that? And you know, I think there's so much scandal and inference of scandal that's generated. We often forget some of the important detail. But a man by the name of A.J. Suklal, a bureaucrat who worked for the Department of Trade and Industry during the late 1990s, the 2000s, had become effectively a whistleblower. And he had fallen out with a very powerful French arms company called Thales. And in his arbitration process, it was a confidential process and some of those documents were leaked, and Mr. Suklal has subsequently gone on record. In fact, he has filed his own affidavits at the police station in Pretoria that set out some of these arguments. But he argues that he had worked very closely with President Jacob Zuma. And as we know, during the late 1990s, in that 70 billion rand arms deal that was so riddled with corruption, Thales was not one of the biggest beneficiaries of contracts, but it won a very important subcontract in that deal. And it is alleged that Thales paid bribes to President Zuma, amongst others. And from there stems those 783 counts of fraud, bribery, money laundering that are linked to President Zuma. And Suklal says that the code word that was used by Zuma was, once he had received the bribe money, was "the lights have gone on the Eiffel Tower." He had received the money from France, and he confirms receipt of the cash. And I think he argues, and clearly one of the reasons why the president has fought hardest to ensure that the NPA doesn't hold into account that he isn't prosecuted for corruption, because although there are many very serious, very important allegations of involvement in the so-called Gupta state capture network, the allegations of corruption as they are in the arms deal are those that are most likely to stick in terms of the possibility of prosecuting the president and sending him to prison. And once you dig through, and which we've done, and through Suklal's papers, we start to hear an extraordinary story of how he would accompany, as a Department of Trade and Industry official, before he starts to work for the French in the early 2000s, Thabo Mbeki, to trips to France. They met then President Jacques Chirac, and Chirac, at one of those meetings, leans on Mbeki very clearly to say, you need to make these investigations of corruption into the arms deal go away. And it is alleged by Suklal that Mbeki comes back to South Africa, and Penuel Maduna, then Minister of Justice, is asked to effectively help stymie aspects of those investigations. Now, Penuel Maduna is the chairman of a very, very prominent law firm in this city and in Johannesburg, so I'm not going to say anything more about him. But needless to say, we are in the situation where we are today, where there has not been any prosecution of any corporation linked to the arms deal. And how is it that Thales came to play this role? And I really want us to focus on that corporation for a moment in our politics. And we'd argue we need to look back. And one of the places we need to look back to is 1988. It's March, the end of March 1988 in Paris. Mike, if you don't mind, have you got that ready? Thank you. It's the end of March. You see the map of Paris behind us, and it's the end of March 1988. And let me just see. I'm pointing towards the ANC office in Paris. A activist, a very brave woman by the name of Dulcie September, who is from Athlone, from Cape Town, who's been imprisoned for many years, sent to Kroonstad in the northern part of our country for her political activity in the 1960s. And she eventually goes into exile in the early 1970s. She's not a member of the African National Congress. She's a supporter of the anti-apartheid movement, and gradually starts to work closely with the ANC in London. And after a number of postings, she is posted to France in 1983. And Dulcie September, on that morning in 1988, when she opens the office, has spent almost 5 years in Paris as the ANC's representative. And remember, when we say the ANC's representative, in fact, when we read through the records of the ANC's archive at Fort Hare University in Alice, it really operates like we imagine many small civil society organizations do. The center for the anti-apartheid movement in the ANC was very much London and Lusaka, and places like Paris were important, but there were far bigger areas of activity. And so Dulcie September has been responsible for France, for Switzerland, and for Luxembourg, the small country where we described the bank, Credit Bank Luxembourg, the main arms corps' main money laundering bank, was operating from. And she led various anti-apartheid activities and trying to disrupt the sale of goods to the apartheid government and raise awareness working with civil society organizations in those countries. But on that fateful morning, she opens her office with a handbag on her arm, as she had done so many mornings. She's a trained operative, and by all accounts from her comrades and friends, a very security-conscious person. And she is shot by an assassin. A number of bullets, I think 5, 6, 7 bullets, enter her body, and she's murdered. And next year, it'll be 30 years since Dulcie September's murder, and we don't know who murdered Dulcie September until today. And it's an extraordinary story, not only because it's one of those stories like the murder of Ahmed Timol and others, where there's a sense that certainly the state has been involved. How could they not have been involved? But there has been no final reckoning of who, in fact, the actual perpetrators are. And we tried our best to try and figure out, and I'll tell you why, who was involved in Dulcie September's murder, but we tried our best to figure out who had murdered her, because we felt that so much of the illicit activities to supply the apartheid government with weapons was linked to Paris. In fact, the more we dug, the more we started to realize that other than Tel Aviv, Paris really was the center for arms corps activities around the world. We've often heard of Paris being a center, but from the 1960s, there's a long history of supplying those weapons. And Dulcie September, we believe, was on the trail of trying to understand who was supplying those weapons. She wasn't only in Switzerland loading up South African goods, canned fruit, and walking to the checkout counter, and then in a moment of protest refusing to pay and unpacking all of it and saying we shouldn't buy South Africa. She was, according to documents we've seen, engaged in trying to track the sale of weapons. She was investigating, in her handwritten notes, we see banks that had been set up by, it is alleged, the CIA in Australia in the late 70s, early 80s, a bank called Nugan Hand, the center of many conspiracies. And there you see Dulcie September has made notes about some of those activities. But importantly for us, she, in her documents, writes about a French arms company called Thomson CSF, or Thomson and Key. And Thomson CSF Thomson CSF established a large, partly today, then state-owned, largely state-owned, was from the late 1960s assisting the apartheid regime to develop its missile technology. In fact, co-developing missile technology, P.W. Botha travels to France as the Minister of Defense in the late 1960s, meets with the head honchos at Thomson CSF and the French government to view the testing of these missiles that they had developed together. And throughout the 70s and 80s, we see Thomson CSF's continued involvement in letter exchanges with various South African officials. But when Dulcie September is investigating arms sales, it's Thomson CSF that one of the companies she seems most fearful of. She gets threatening phone calls. Her address is publicized by Jean-Marie Le Pen, the right-wing leader of the neo-fascist group in France. But it is Thomson CSF where she also gets phone calls from she can't quite understand. And of course, by the 1980s, by the late 1980s, early 1990s, Thomson CSF are looking at South Africa not only as a source of selling clandestine weapons. With the release of Nelson Mandela by the early 1990s, they've established an office in South Africa. And it's around that point that Thomson CSF starts the process of rebranding. And it is rebranded as the company Thales. And Thales, of course, is the company which we've spoken of that is alleged to have bribed President Jacob Zuma. And so we see an extraordinary tale of a corporation which was active allegedly in busting sanctions, of supplying weapons to the apartheid regime from the 1960s, 70s. Questions that need to be asked of the company's potential knowledge in the facts around the murder of Dulcie September, and certainly a massive amount of evidence that the company is alleged to have bribed the president of a democratic South Africa. And therein, we argue, is one of the reasons why we've never got to the bottom of the links between France and South Africa. But that isn't the only one. What else could Dulcie September have been investigating? And on this map, we've got a couple of Thomson CSF's headquarters, the Élysée, which is the French presidential residence. This is the Seine, the river running through the center of Paris. But the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is on the Seine, located here. And not far from that, only a couple of blocks, if you have a look on Google Earth, is the South African Embassy. And the evidence that we've managed to collect shows that the South African embassy was in fact the beehive, the center of arms sanctions busting for Armscor in Europe, most of Europe, and possibly part of the Soviet Union in that period of the late 70s into the early 1990s. On the 5th floor of the South African embassy, approximately 30 South African officials, all Armscor officials, were based. We've seen documents in which Armscor writes to the Department of Foreign Affairs requesting permission for them to be stationed at the embassy. So there was clear knowledge by Pik Botha's ministry of what was going on. Botha is one of those that always, like Foreign diplomacy, claims plausible deniability, but a man who knew exactly what was going on during that period. And the officials, we believe there were approximately between 25 and 30 of them at any given time. Their primary task was to bust sanctions. They would travel across Western Europe. They would deal with arms dealers, with middlemen, and with governments. And how is it that they were able to operate for a period of almost 20 years, undisturbed at the very heart of Paris? The documents that we obtained, and I want to just talk very briefly about these documents we obtained in France, are so clear that the prime link to the French state was through the French Secret Service, called the DGSE. We see notes of meetings, heads of the DGSE and its predecessor, which operated under another name, the French Foreign Intelligence Service, who throughout the 70s and 80s were meeting with top South African officials. In the early 1980s, they in fact proposed that they wanted to build a new missile system based on a Soviet model, and possibly jointly build and fund that in a factory in either Egypt or Morocco, which they could then use in different places, with people thinking the weapons actually came from the East. As far as the late 1980s, we think about the extensive pressure the apartheid regime is under. We see the head of French intelligence services meeting with the head of the South African army, the South African military intelligence, and the French intelligence services offering to provide the most sophisticated weapons technology that the French had at their disposal, the Mistral missile, to the South Africans to use in Angola. And at that point, by their own admission, not even French military had direct access to this missiles technology. So it isn't a question of this just being an ancillary, interesting relationship between the French and the apartheid government. It was a long-standing, close relationship that goes to the very core of French establishment. Jacques Chirac, amongst others, were the people who knew about this because he sent his emissaries, people like a man by the name of Jean-Yves Olivier, who is a businessman, a sanctions buster, of whom a documentary was produced a few years ago, who's modeled himself as a big peace broker in South Africa. Olivier is a sanctions buster. By probably many people's reckoning, he was a criminal at the time, and he certainly helped to facilitate the links, keeping arm's length from Chirac to the South Africans, but ensuring that those links were there at a time when Chirac was Prime Minister of France and there was a socialist president under Mitterrand at the time. So I've given you quite an extensive overview, and before I hand over to Michael, of France, but we think it's such a central element to understand the nature of the duplicity of these relationships, and that they really were at the core of what was happening in the state at the time, and perhaps explains the kind of pressures that the South African government has been under for many years, in many ways, unspoken ways, not to release all the information about the true nature of these relationships. Mike, can I hand over to you? Yeah.
Morning, everyone. Is that clear? Yes. Great. That hasn't? Yes, that worked eventually. So Henny's described the beehive in Paris, this office that is used to procure weapons from around the world, but predominantly from Western Europe, a lot of the time from France. We told you the story at the end of yesterday about the Portuguese deal to send weapons via France. And Henny's touched on as well the office in Tel Aviv, which at some point by Polakar-Saransky's estimates is one, the South African market is one of the single biggest boons to the Israeli economy following the wars in the 1970s, just because of the sheer number of weapons and ammunition that they were purchasing. And so the question often comes then, particularly in the South African context, the question that comes to us is that, but of course this weapons trade was happening. It's all about the Cold War. Everything has to be understood in the context of the Cold War. South Africa was a bulwark against Soviet expansion, and they were vehemently anti-communist. And that pretty much explains everything here. And so this was a major challenge for Henny and I when we were doing the research, to understand how much of this was true and how much of what we were reading about the politics and the ability of the apartheid state to forge relationships in different places, what that meant for that narrative. And what was so interesting about what we found is that for a regime that claimed to be so vehemently anti-communist, the apartheid state was very, very good at doing deals with communists. As early as the late 1970s and early 1980s, what we've established is that the apartheid state were doing quite extensive weapons deals with East Germany, with other countries in the Soviet bloc, Bulgaria, etc., definitely making overtures to the Soviet Union by the late 1980s. And where I'm going to start the story with communist China. So one of these arms corps officers, much less prominent than the one in Paris or the one in Tel Aviv, there was an arms corps contingent based in Hong Kong at one point, in order to facilitate this go-between between apartheid military intelligence, arms corps officials, and the People's Republic of China. And particularly what they managed to do by the early 1980s was form a relationship with a Chinese state-owned arms company called Norinco. Now, we, as Henny mentioned yesterday, we did interviews with around about 120 individuals for this book, and one of them was an ex-military intelligence official, quite senior official, based outside of Pretoria. And when we spoke to him, he was very quick to remind us that although, of course, the military was deployed inside South Africa and the police were conducting or meting out violence against South Africans, South Africa's predominant military needs were for its border wars and the wars that it was engaging in, particularly in Angola, but also in Mozambique and elsewhere. And so they needed weapons to fight in those wars. They also needed weapons in order to feed their allies, right? Whether that was UNITA in Angola or other allies in the region. And the problem that they faced was that if you send, particularly early on in these wars, when you're still trying to create a facade of not being involved potentially in those conflicts, Arms Corps and the South African military did not want to supply vast amounts of South African weapons to those fighters, particularly UNITA, because any fines then make it very conspicuous what they're doing. And so what came out of these two relationships was essentially a very convenient mutual match, because the state-owned arms company, Norinco, was very happy to get a lot of money in at this stage for the weapons. And the apartheid state, what better source of weapons to flood into a place like Angola than weapons that originate in the People's Republic of China? This confuses the battlefield, of course, because the PRC is at the same time arming SWAPO in Namibia, right? So the PRC is formally completely anti-apartheid and pro-liberation movements in Namibia, Angola, and elsewhere. And yet, what we find is that in the early 1980s, Arms Corps has managed essentially to get a commitment from Norinco to send them thousands of AK-47s, hundreds of 200-kilogram bombs, and crates of ammunition to run the small arms and machine guns that they are going to send to South Africa. So Arms Corps has the commitment from the PRC to do this. But one of the things that we mentioned yesterday and again this morning is that particularly for a country like China, with its very public anti-apartheid stance, that becomes very difficult to do directly. They don't want to ship weapons from Shanghai to Durban. And so what you need to do is find what we call a proxy country. Some sort of mutual ally in the middle, often that has already existing connections with either state, who's willing to act as an intermediary for your weapons. And in this case, and this was something that I suppose we found quite surprising in the book, or in the research for the book, was that apartheid military intelligence had formed a very strong relationship with Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire from about the same period, the early 1980s. The relationship is so strong that very soon they're having annual meetings, sharing intelligence. The apartheid military begins to build a listening station in Zaire. And Sese Seko, a notorious kleptocrat who stole basically everything that he could from Zaire, now the DRC, also had a relationship with Communist China. And so what was agreed by apartheid officials visiting Zaire is that they, with the help of a front company, similar to the one that I described yesterday, this one was called Adam Export, that they would buy end-user certificates, and I'm going to come back to that phrase because I used it yesterday and someone asked me afterwards what an end-user certificate is, and it's a very good question. That they would buy end-user certificates and use Zaire as a front to say that only Zaire was buying those weapons. So if you look over here to that document that you almost certainly can't read because it's very old and faded and taken from an archive, at the top there you have, so it's an invoice, and over there it says costs related to EUC, which stands for End User Certificate, US dollars 2 million. An end user certificate, just to explain this very briefly, is simply a document from a state promising not to re-export anything that it receives, and simply saying, we are the end user of the products. So in this case, it's the Zaire state saying, we are the end user of the 250, 200 kilogram bombs that the Chinese are sending us, so don't worry. essentially. They won't go on anywhere else. This was used extensively by the apartheid state. As you can see, it's expensive. An end-user certificate is one piece of paper, $2 million. $2 million in 1984. It's a huge amount of money. But of course, that has to go to many places, including Mobutu Sese Seko, because he's obviously not going to allow such a deal to happen without receiving something as part of the deal. And so, and also, sorry, while I'm on this document, just to say, if you have a look there, it says bank, Credit Bank Luxembourg, the bank that we spoke about yesterday. This is one of the few instances, actually, where we found a first-hand document in the archive that confirms the other material that we found on the bank that was actually printed on a document. So this was really an example, I guess, of that arms money machine that we described yesterday. This is an example in practice. And so what happened, you can see on this image, the ship leaves Shanghai. It's a Danish ship called the Vlinderslong. I think that's probably pronounced incorrectly, but that's as close as I'm going to get. Danish ships, Danish shipping companies were actually used quite extensively to traffic arms for the apartheid state. But it moves up, it goes around the top of Africa through the Mediterranean down to Zaire. There's a port called Matadi in there. And what they do is the ship arrives, it offloads all of the weapons, but of course you have an end-user certificate saying that none of those things will leave the country. And so what you then do is you have another front company in Zaire that provides you an invoice, and I think I mentioned this yesterday, but the invoice says 16,000 cooking sets, 2,000 bicycles, and 5,000 plows. And suddenly all the bombs, all the guns, all the ammunition are just transferred into agricultural implements. They're put back on the same ship and they're shipped down the coast around the Cape to Durban. And once there, we assume, distributed into the conflicts throughout Southern Africa. One sort of interesting part of the story, which is just kind of incidental, is that the Vlinderslong is quite late getting to Matadi from Shanghai, and it happens to arrive at exactly the same time that a Soviet ship is docking. And essentially Arms Corps panic because they have to dock the ship next to the Russian sailors, and they've got all the weapons on board. So they kind of have to make this kind of last-minute panic plan to ensure that nothing gets offloaded too soon and that everything is clandestine. But they manage to kind of wait it out, wait for the ship to leave. And it's kind of funny, all these crazy international deals, and you happen to dock next to the Russians. It's kind of unlucky. So that's a little insight into the Chinese relationship. That runs throughout the 1980s, often through Zaire. And from the late 1980s, there is then as well the allegation that the Chinese are assisting South Africa with its nuclear project as well. So these are two states purportedly dire Soviet war era enemies, which essentially are doing great business throughout the sanctions period because it was mutually beneficial for both of them. Now, what I want to do is, it's impossible to discuss in this amount of time the entire US relationship, but what I wanted to do was use the China story as a hook to speak about the United States because it really allows us to, I suppose, see some of the craziness in the tale. Sorry, so just in the interim, that image just tells you a little bit about some of what we call the proxies, players, and pariahs. So states like Zaire there. And what you'll see is that even these states were pretty well spread around the world. While I'm here, one last word on China. South Africa, apartheid South Africa also had a very close relationship with Singapore and with Singaporean officials in the 1980s. And at one point, and I can't remember the exact date, but the Singapore military officials that the apartheid government is in contact with come to the South Africans and say, you don't happen to have any spare small arms that we could send to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And the apartheid official writes back and says, luck would have it, the Chinese have sent us so much that we have enough to send on. It's quite a staggering thing, because one of the bureaucrats on the South African side says, we're really worried, we're not sure we should be sending this much. And the other official writes back and says, don't worry, we're flooded. We've got so much we don't know what to do with it, you're more than welcome to send them on. It provides you a little bit of an insight into the nature, I guess, of the global arms trade and the ability of weapons to move around to sort of unintended places and bounce around. And it raises many questions, of course, today, places like conflicts like Yemen, where weapons are flooding into those countries from. But if you'll allow me just a few minutes on the United States, the apartheid state's relationship with the US is multifaceted, and it's also very complicated, because the United States government is probably, and you even see that today in many ways, it's one of the more, we could call it schizophrenic, essentially. So in this period, particularly after Reagan's election in the 1980s, you've got a CIA that is very emboldened, that is taking actions and interfering around the world. And the CIA, according to documents that we've found, essentially tell anyone in the US who tells them to stop dealing with South Africa to go away. They essentially say it's too useful for us to maintain the connections. So whatever you think, we're not going to change that. And with Reagan's election, that gives them all the ammunition they need. Because, of course, for Reagan, he's quite happy for the intelligence agency to essentially do what it wants and gives it a lot of space. But at the same time, a lot of US law enforcement remained quite anti-apartheid and would pursue people in those countries who were engaging in sanctions-busting activity. And one of the interesting cases here is a US company led by a man called James Guerin. It was called International Signal and Control, or ISC. And it's eventually disbanded in the early 1990s because it commits one of the biggest frauds ever seen in the US, in the arms industry globally. Guerin is found guilty of laundering $950 million in fictitious contracts in order to boost the balance books of ISC. And so he's sent to prison. As part of that indictment, and as part of when he's found guilty, he's also found guilty of shipping $50 million worth of missile technology to the apartheid state. Now, we could not find a document that proves this absolutely, but the US's own officials, including an Undersecretary for State for African Affairs, in the inquiries that happened afterwards, essentially said that the CIA agents who had been called had lied to him, and he didn't believe anything that he'd said. And so the strong suspicion from him and other US authorities was that the CIA had put ISC in contact with the South African officials in order to facilitate the movement of weapons. That would not be entirely surprising, because we have seen in other cases of these kind of transactions that either a CIA agent or ex-CIA agent is often the person in the middle who makes the connection with the arms company to do the facilitation fee. What does this have to do with China? There's an incredible Arms Corps memorandum in, I believe, 1989, 1990 that we stumble across that mentions the US investigation into James Guerin and ISC. And essentially what it is, it's an internal memo saying what are the possible ramifications for us, given that the source of the technology has now been found and the investigations are taking place. And this actually has ongoing diplomatic ramifications for US-South African relations that we can maybe discuss afterwards. But in this memo, there's a very convenient spreadsheet about, or sort of diagram of what South Africa was doing with international signal and controls missile technology. And what were they doing? They were redeveloping and they were selling it to the Chinese. And we found a missile made by the Chinese, I think it's called the ZT-3, which is essentially that technology that they've then developed from the South Africans. So what we have is we have Communist China sending South Africa small arms to use in Southern Africa. a CIA-linked company sending missile technology from the United States clandestinely to South Africa, South Africa reusing that technology, selling it back to communist China, all in the context of a Cold War that is supposed to, in principle, be keeping these states very far apart. I think there's a lot more to say that we could say about the United States, about some of the lobbying that was engaged in, but I think that I should hand back to Henny to discuss the UK before we run out of time.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks. Mike has given us, I think, a great way in, again, to understanding the links with the intelligence services in various countries. We spoke yesterday of something called the deep state, that network of political parties, politicians, arms companies, middlemen, big businesses, and intelligence services that often work hand in glove to undermine the democratic intention at the very least. And I think that many of these case studies show this deep state. It's not a conspiracy. I think Donald Trump is the one who likes to talk about himself being his greatest enemy being some kind of liberal deep state. Well, if anything, anyone who I think exemplifies that deep state at work, it probably is somebody like Donald Trump. But we see in these networks the kind of power that they are able to exert and the extent to which they are able to subvert the public interest. And maybe just to end us off this morning, I'd like to very briefly talk about the United Kingdom because of South Africa's long-standing relationship with Britain, South Africa's primary trading partner during the 1980s and still an important trading partner today. And of course, given our colonial past, it was also the center for the anti-apartheid movement, as we've said. So it's another country of many contradictions, and I think that's something that the very many shades of grey are important, I think, for us to remember. But in the book we've identified, instead of trying to unpick every speech that Margaret Thatcher gave against sanctions, and as Mike set out, we saw the rise of Ronald Reagan, the conservative governments in the United States and in Britain, which happened at roughly at the same time. Jacques Chirac, in and out during that period of the 1980s. But these were all very powerful forces in conservative politics and allies of the apartheid government in many ways. But they were constrained by civil society in their countries. They were constrained by opposition forces who did their best to ensure that pressure was put to ensure that there was an overt supply of weapons. They didn't have the luxury of being ruled by a Politburo or a an Africa desk of the Communist Party in China, which is able to make decisions about how the state-owned arms company in China, Norinco, supplies weapons and is not held to account by any media, which of course was different in countries like the United Kingdom. And there's some great passages in interviews with Pik Botha, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, in which he describes meetings with Margaret Thatcher. And they're extraordinary in many ways because they're such a reminder of what a deeply superficial human being somebody like Pik Botha is. And I say it now because he will pass away in some years and there'll be a eulogy to say he knew many people. But when really quizzed about Margaret Thatcher, I think that the one thing that Pik Botha can most fondly remember are in fact her breasts. And I say that because those are Botha's words. That's, and I think we sometimes should remind ourselves at the essence that these are people who like to present themselves as many emperors, who could travel around the world, but were at some level are very basic human beings too. And so the relationship, although Botha's recollection may be that of his relationship or connection with Margaret Thatcher, Thatcher was no doubt a staunch supporter of relations with South Africa, and there was reason for that. As we've seen in documents we collected from the British archives in Kew, and as I explained yesterday, many documents we weren't able to access, but Britain was worried. They were worried about what sanctions would mean for trade with Britain. The most profitable route for British Airways was South Africa in the globe. If you decided to cut that route, what would that mean for the bottom line of a then still partly state-owned company. What would it mean for South Africa as a trading partner for Britain? Those are many of the questions. And so what was relied upon in part were some of these men who play the role of the connectors, who operate very much within that deep state framework which we've described. And two of the men which we identified in themselves are worthy of a series of lectures only because of the role that they played not only in South Africa but also around the globe. The first of whom I'd like to speak of is a man after whom a mine shaft is named in the Northwest Province. A platinum mine shaft by the name of Tiny Rowland. I'm not sure those who may know of him, but again, another man like Pip Botha described, larger than life, a colourful character, and a man who quite clearly operated within a criminal framework at times as well. And Rowland, who had been born in had moved between Germany and the United Kingdom in his youth, had, I think, been a member of the Hitler Youth for a short period as well, eventually moves to what was then Rhodesia in the 1950s, 1960s, and gains control of the company which we know of as Lonrho. Lonrho, of course, today is the company Lonmin. And Lonmin is the company where at Marikana those 34 mine workers were murdered in 2012 by police. And it wasn't very far from Tiny Rowland's mine shaft. The mine shaft named after what we understand to be named after Tiny Rowland at Marikana. So what is the history of a company like what we know as Lonmin? Apparently it's about to be potentially bought up by other interests and may no longer be known as Lonmin. But when we look at the history of Lonmin, operating as Lonrho through a man like Tiny Rowland, Rowland spent many years trying to court the apartheid regime. He's well known for flitting around the African continent in his Gulfstream jet, and as he once remarked, looking out the window of the Gulfstream jet, flying, I think with the Zambian Minister of Foreign Affairs, he looked out the window of the Gulfstream jet as they were flying possibly over somewhere in Central Africa, and he said, "I can buy any president down there." And he had a way in with leaders across the continent. Strong support of Jonas Savimbi's rebel group, UNITA. I don't know if that was because he thought Savimbi was a great man, or whether Savimbi would be the way in which he could unlock full access to Angola's very rich oil and diamond resources. Very active in Zambia, meeting with Kenneth Kaunda on a regular basis. Daniel Arap Moi, known as a very corrupt president of Kenya at the time, was also a man who frequently welcomed Tiny Rowland to Zambia. But what we found in these documents, military intelligence documents in Pretoria, was something that hadn't yet been revealed to the full extent, was that Rowland, with his Gulfstream jet, would frequently touch down at Waterkloof Air Force Base. Remember Waterkloof, where the Guptas were not supposed to land their private jets, right? So that same Waterkloof Air Force Base, Tiny Rowland had been doing this for a long time before the Guptas, would land at Waterkloof Air Force Base, and then he would then meet with military intelligence officials. He'd book himself in at the Burgers Park Hotel, which is still in Pretoria, and I was there recently, and it has an Oliver Tambo suite and a Nelson Mandela meeting room, but that's where Tiny Rowland, it still looks a bit like the 1970s, would overnight and meet with military intelligence. And from the mid-1970s, we see him actively engaged in trying to promote the interests of the apartheid state throughout Southern Africa. His meetings with Henry Kissinger in 1975, at the time that the South Africans have invaded Angola, and Kissinger says that the South Africans should take total control of Angola, which they didn't do. In one of those meetings, we see Rowland being present. And without going into all of the details, an extraordinary set of meetings with military intelligence officials who are feeling out Rowland, working through a middleman, a prominent Pretoria-based heart surgeon, Dr. Marquardt de Villiers, whose son goes on to head the Disney World Corporation. Sometimes we can't quite make this all up. But if you ever see a de Villiers in Disney World, you'll know that his father, well, you'll have a little bit of an inkling if you read the book of where his father was during the war. But he wasn't only a heart surgeon. And With the assistance of Roland, contacts were made with the Israelis. David Kimchi, who had been the deputy head of Mossad and a very prominent figure in Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, through Roland offered so-called red-eye missiles, the Stinger surface-to-air missiles, to the apartheid regime. And these are some of the weapons that Roland was prepared to offer. Now, the question that's worth asking is, could Roland have done all of this without the understanding of intelligence services in the United States and Great Britain? We certainly don't believe so. People like Robin Renwick, the former South African ambassador, I would argue has I'm not sure if it's a naive view, it might be a cynical view, or it might be a biased view, that Roland was an outsider. And many people in the British establishment speak of him as such. But I guess it's a question of where do we locate the centre of this British establishment? For our interests in South Africa, I think we look a lot at the role of intelligence services. We look at the extent to which Roland would fly US officials from the State Department and elsewhere to meet Savimbi in Angola, telling them that they were flying to meet Savimbi in Namibia, showing them sort of a picture on the map of where they were going. And in fact, they did cross the border. They would go and meet Savimbi in Jamba. And so I had this extraordinary access to top officials from around the globe. And perhaps it shows, just in brief, the kind of connections that these type of businessmen were able to play. A second businessman I speak to very briefly is a man by the name of Julian Amery. Lord Amery was again unlike Roland, wasn't seen as an outsider of the British establishment, a conservative at heart. He'd come from a family whose father had served in South Africa during the South African War, and was a very close associate of Milner, of Kitchener, and had actually served in Chamberlain's cabinet. So from the very heart of the British establishment. And by the 1950s, Amery, at this stage, is a British member of Parliament. He's only made it peer later in his life, joins the House of Lords. But Amery, as a member of Parliament, is at the behest of a very conservative group within the Conservative Party called the Monday Club. 50s and 60s, the Monday Club sees as their primary role to support and defend Rhodesia, to argue against immigration to Britain to the extent that incentives should be provided to any people of colour who move to the United Kingdom to leave the United Kingdom. I think if you had to think of a rougher version of Nigel Farage and UKIP in the United Kingdom today, there's a person like, I think, Julian Amery probably precisely embodies that. And our interest in Amery, though, is not so much his obvious racism and his desire to remain connected with the former colonies, and as he said, because those are the things that make Britain great. It is the colonies, it's access to raw materials in large parts of Africa and South Asia and other former colonies. Instead, we, after long struggle, had managed to get documents declassified, which had been authored in the early 90s by something called the Kahn Commission. Ellison Kahn, professor at Wits for many years, had been asked to undertake an audit of secret projects by F.W. de Klerk's government. 1992, as they're busy winding down some of the more controversial non-military secret projects. And there we found contributions that were made in this declassified documents that were declassified for the very first time, of contributions made by the Department of Foreign Affairs over many years from the 1970s to the early 1990s to a group called Le Cercle, the Circle. And what we there stumbled across, and perhaps to leave you with it, the grand conspiracy is never a good thing at the end of a lecture, but and you'll read more about this in the book, an extraordinarily influential group that had met from the 1950s and still meets today, mostly in Europe, of conservative businessmen,